De que ya viene la revolución, para que se asustan será para mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito, nada.
Los imperialistas yanquis pretenden ahora igualmente identificar el movimiento de liberación nacional y la lucha de los pueblos por cambios sociales con el terrorismo. Para ellos, ser revolucionario, ser simplemente progresista o luchador por la democracia es ser terrorista. Con estas falacias y mentiras, abandonan definitivamente la hoja de parra de los derechos humanos para proclamarse una vez más con toda impudicia gendarmes mundiales. En la América Latina, escribiendo la intervención como espectro, amenazan en primer término a los patriotas de El Salvador y Guatemala con siniestros planes agresivos y arman en esas naciones a gobiernos sanguinarios verdaderamente genocidas, mientras lanzan groseras calumnias contra los países socialistas y progresistas, tratando de demostrar que lo que ocurre en Centroamérica no es resultado de la justa rebeldía de los pueblos frente a los crímenes, la larga opresión y la despiadada explotación imperialista, sino consecuencia de supuestas conspiraciones internacionales. Al mismo tiempo, obstaculizan, hostigan y tratan de intimidar al pueblo revolucionario de Nicaragua. Ayudan y alientan a las dictaduras más corruptas y criminales de nuestro continente y socavan la labor de todo gobierno que hable con voz propia o pretenda mejoras para el pueblo, mostrando su propósito de implantar un dominio cada vez más férreo sobre todo el hemisferio. A 90 millas de nuestra patria hay voces que proclaman la necesidad de destruirnos. Se nos amenaza abiertamente con imponernos un bloqueo militar y se analizan métodos aún más drásticos con el propósito de borrar de América Latina el ejemplo de Cuba socialista y castigar al pueblo cubano por su amistad con la URSS y la comunidad socialista, por su solidaridad irrenunciable con los pueblos de África y el movimiento revolucionario y progresista mundial. La noble causa del socialismo, la aspiración a un mundo justo, libre, pacífico y humano no podrán ser barridas jamás de la faz de la tierra.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 63, Unmasking Imperialism, Exposing Imperialist Propaganda in Mainstream Media, coming into an amazing speech by Fidel Castro, Comandante Fidel, at the Soviet Union, speaking about the hypocrisy of Western so-called human rights and how the imperialists always lie and manipulate information to make it seem like they're the defenders of human rights and the socialist nations are terrorists and evil. So we're going to be talking about the hypocrisy of so-called human rights organizations and think tanks based in the global north. We're going to debunk some of the imperialist lies spewed during a recent webinar hosted by the Council on Foreign Relations, which was titled Democracy in Latin America, basically a review and overview of recent political developments in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we're going to talk about some of the shady financial forces behind these human rights organizations, in parentheses, and also who's funding them, why they serve as extensions of U.S. imperialism and the State Department, and how they serve to manipulate public opinion for regime change efforts. And joining me today is my homie, my comrade, compañero, Abraham Márquez, out here in LA, revolutionary freelance journalist based in LA. And Abraham is a member of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists and a 2021 USC Annenberg Center for Health Journalism Fellow. And Abraham recently traveled to Nicaragua late last year to witness and observe the elections in Nicaragua, a country that has been slandered by mainstream imperialist press for its Sandinista revolution. And he has a lot of great content on his social media and online as well related to Nicaragua. How's it going, compañero Abraham?
It's going good, man. Thank you. Your intro just got me like revved up listening to Chess speech and Fidel. It was very refreshing.
Most definitely, man. I appreciate that. You know, Fidel Castro always said it like it is. You know, where are the imperialists when they talk about human rights? When we're talking about Africa or Asia or Latin America, and he's somebody who said it like it is. And I think, especially when we're talking about propaganda in the 21st century, he would have so much to say now about what's going on. Shout out to everybody who's watching, listening, to B-Level, to Itzel, to Ill State Fishing, to Jason, to Virtual Succubus, interesting name there. Shout out to everybody who's watching and listening. And we're going to take a look at this webinar because I was looking online at, Latin American news and politics. And there's this recent webinar hosted by the Council on Foreign Relations. And what I want to do is kind of, before getting into this webinar, I want to walk you through my experience, because just for clarity and transparency, I actually used to intern at the Council on Foreign Relations many years ago. I was living in New York. I went to NYU as a grad student there. And just to illustrate more or less how I was, and this is part of my political transformation as well, this is an old picture of me. This is me wearing, you can't even recognize me. This is me in my, we got to polish up and get a seat at the table days and dress well for the imperialists and get accepted. You know, I grew up in New York. I grew up in very working class hood areas in New York. So for me and a lot of the people around me, advancement and advancing in your career, which my career, what I was studying at the time was politics, and I was really interested in the topic of human rights and everything. It was, you got to dress up and wear a suit and shave and cut your hair. And this is exactly who I was. This is me as I'm becoming a communist. I just wanted to share that because this is part of my transformation, right? This is part of what a lot of us go through in decolonizing ourselves, decolonizing our mind when we're learning about communism and even human rights. Because this guy that you're seeing right now in the screen, he cared about human rights. He cared about Latin American liberty. It wasn't that I was right wing or anything, but my understanding of human rights and advancing progress and humanity was through these bourgeois liberal institutions. Like, let's take over these NGOs. Let's do this. Let's adjust, work within the system and empire to fix it from within. And so at this time period, actually around the time I took this picture, I was interning at the Council on Foreign Relations. I was, to be 100% honest with y'all, I was probably just a diversity hire. They were probably just like, all right, we need like a, yeah, check off the box. They're like, all right, we need one of them. We need one Latino, because literally it was like intern class of like 30 people, and it was like 28 white dude, like mainly white dudes, and then it was like me and this other black woman who was there. So we're like, all right, they got their Latino check and they got their, their black diversity hire and Latino diversity hire. So, and Chairman Ramos and Dan Ramiro looking like he's about to manufacture consent. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and actually, again, right, for full transparency, part of my my role as an intern there was helping with like designing, and it wasn't necessarily ideological or anything like that. It was kind of like laying out, because I had a lot of experience with newspaper work and journalism and stuff like that. So it was like laying out stuff. And it was actually through my internship at the CFR that I became even more communist, that I became even more anti-imperialist, and seeing like, damn, these motherfuckers are fucking evil. Like, there are some shady ass forces behind these NGOs that claim to be in favor of human rights, that claim to be in favor of democracy and freedom. And you have all these mega corporations that are backing them, and all these, they had all these meetings all the time at the CFR office in New York. And it was like really top people, wealthy corporations. And some of the events they would have in-house were like, how to urgently bring democracy to Cuba, or like how to urgently bring democracy to Venezuela. And just seeing that like really opened my eyes. I was like, wow, like these motherfuckers are crazy. And a lot of big financial institutions are behind, not just even CFR, Amnesty International, Freedom House, right? All these NGOs that claim to be nonpartisan, non-governmental, they have people, a revolving door of U.S. State Department officials coming in and out, advising them. Big companies, ExxonMobil, the NED, so these are arms of U.S. imperialism. These are arms of human rights imperialists. And one of them is CFR. So I wanted to kind of lay that out beforehand, because I've seen firsthand what these institutions are like. And so I found this webinar, I was kind of like going back in time and seeing this webinar about human rights and in Latin America and the Caribbean. So what I want to do is kind of just, play some of it and talk about, react to it. But maybe before I do that, I don't know, Abraham, if you want to talk a little bit about, because you, as a journalist yourself, like you, I'm sure, have navigated some of these circles of like respectable politics or respectable human rights organizations. What is your view or analysis or experience of these sort of like human rights industrial complex?
And just like you said, they are an arm, an extension of empire. They don't care about humans. They don't care about the well-being of people, even in their own country. The U.S. will say that, in Nicaragua, there's human rights abuses. When I got to Nicaragua in November, I was fortunate enough to be in Honduras and Guatemala 2 months before, and I got to see and walk in the barrios there that it's not safe. Crime is up, poverty is up, people are struggling, people are suffering. There's not much work besides working for a U.S. corporation, fast food, retail. And then in Nicaragua, it was just like, the first few nights when we went out into the towns, I was like, no one was like supervising us. There was no one like looking out for us. There was like everyone. I was like, is this like, my mind couldn't even handle like, people feel safe in Nicaragua. People feel comfortable in their country. They're defending their country. They have respect for other people. And I was just like, wow, this is like, as much as we read, but when you're there and you experience it, it's still hard to process. Like, wow, people actually take care of themselves here. So these NGOs, they're an extension to lie to the people, to buy into empire, to buy into, regime change tactics and policies. So eventually when the U.S. does do something, people be like, oh, well, I already heard that they were bad anyways, because they read a headline from CNN.
Yeah, most definitely. There's a huge difference between the situation in Nicaragua versus a lot of the other Central American countries. And it's cool that you got to see that, right? Because we never hear about stuff going on in Honduras or Guatemala, or even today El Salvador under Bukele, but Nicaragua has always been sanctioned and attacked. And so it's interesting to see that. So this webinar basically features one of the one of the main head honchos of Latin American and Caribbean policy for U.S. imperialism. And it's just interesting to hear their analysis. This clip, they're kind of talking about their experience, their analysis, overview of recent stuff going on. So I'm going to play this, and then we'll get into some of the analysis.
We're delighted to have Patrick Duddy with us today to talk about democracy in Latin America. Ambassador Patrick Duddy is the director of Duke University's Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies and teaches in both Duke's Fuqua School of Business and Stanford School of Public Policy. From 2007 to 2010, he served as the U.S. ambassador to Venezuela under both the Bush and Obama administrations. Prior to his assignment to Venezuela, Ambassador Duddy served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere, and he's also held positions at embassies in Brazil, Chile, Bolivia, Paraguay, the Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, and Panama, as worked closely with Haiti. So it is my pleasure to have him with us today. He has served nearly 3 decades in the Foreign Service. He's taught at the National War College, lectured at the State Department's Foreign Service Institute, and is a member of CFR. So Ambassador Duddy, you bring all of your experience to this conversation to talk.
Experienced a lot of coups, by the way. I just want to mention that. The very crucial years, man. So many the coups in Venezuela and Haiti. So yeah.
Talk about this very small question of the state of democracy in Latin America and what U.S. policy should be. It's a broad topic, but I'm going to turn it over to you to give us your insight and analysis.
Well, good afternoon or morning to all of those who have tuned in. And Irina, thank you to you and the other folks at the council for giving me this opportunity. I thought I would begin with sort of a brief introduction, partially rooted in my own experience in the region, and then leave as much time as possible for questions. To start with, let us remember that President Biden held a democracy summit in early December. And in opening that summit, he emphasized that for the current American administration in particular, the defense of democracy is, I believe he said, a defining challenge going ahead. Now, I certainly subscribe to that assertion, but I'd also like to start by reminding folks how far the region has come in recent decades. I flew down to Chile during the Pinochet regime to join the embassy in the very early 1980s. And I recall that the Braniff Airlines flight that took me to Santiago essentially stopped in every burg and dorf with an airport from Miami to Santiago. It used to be called the Milk Run. And in virtually every country in which we landed, there was a military dictatorship, and human rights were honored more in the breach than in fact. Things have really changed quite substantially since then. And during much of the 80s, we saw a pretty constant move in the direction of democracy, and somewhat later in the 80s, also in many parts of Latin America, an embrace of a market-oriented economic policy.
So interesting stuff there. I mean, I think just kind of 2 takeaways to really mention is that first, as somebody mentioned in the comment, Ilstate Fishing said, who are the U.S. to decide who's democratic or not? And I think those dictatorships that he's talking about in the 80s, the military dictatorships, especially in South America with Operation Condor, were U.S. installed dictatorships. And it's interesting that even there, he kind of separates himself from Pinochet, right? From the right-wing dictator in Chile, where saying, oh, the dictatorial regime, even though the U.S. put him in place, right? That was the U.S. that installed him, the U.S. that operated and orchestrated that coup against Salvador Allende in 1973, yet they distance themselves from Pinochet and try to wipe themselves clean of any responsibility of Pinochet and all of those dictators in the 80s. And he says that in the 80s, the U.S. Latin America was moving more toward democracy. If anything, the 80s was probably one of the bloodiest eras of Latin America and the Caribbean. The Contras, right? The Contras in Nicaragua and Guatemala, the genocide against indigenous Maya, the repression against indigenous Mexicans as well in the 80s that led up to the Zapatista uprising, Operation Condor, the murders and deaths of millions of people in Colombia and Chile under Pinochet and Argentina. So it's just really fascinating that he's saying the 80s were some period of democracy and human rights, when in reality it was probably one of the bloodiest. So I don't know, Abraham, what your thoughts are on that.
No, yeah, just to piggyback off what you said, I think it's really disgusting, really, to consider this, to say that this era was an era where human rights were respected, which we know it's the opposite, right? Our brothers and sisters and families were being killed for resisting, were being killed for fighting for self-determination, and it's important that we have outlets like this, because what were those people fighting for, right? They were fighting for basic needs to survive, and I think if you tell it to most people, people will have more of love and sympathy for that than they would for these NGOs.
Yeah, definitely. And even the interesting thing about it is that, as Illstate Fishing mentioned, democracy equals neoliberal capitalism in their eyes. And that's one of the word magic tricks that a lot of times capitalists and imperialists use in terms of trying to convince people that there's a difference between socialism and democracy, whereas like socialism is an economic mode of production that surpasses capitalism. And they try to put democracy and socialism at odds with each other, right? This is a battle between democracy and socialist dictatorship. Well, it's like, okay, democracy in the eyes of the imperialists is neoliberal capitalism. He talked about market-oriented economies where basically the profits are in command, the market is in command, and commodities are able to flow faster through borders than human beings, and commodities are treated with more respect and attention than the needs of working class people. And democracy, whenever I hear pro-democracy activists, immediately you have to stop and think, what kind of spell are they trying to put on us? What kind of nonsense? Because the word democracy is so vague. We can be talking about anything when we're saying pro-democracy activist. And so I think it's something that we have to take with caution. But I don't know, in particular, in the lead up to your visit to Nicaragua, what were you seeing in the media about, the crackdowns on democracy in Nicaragua versus what you actually saw?
Yeah, most of the stuff that I was reading, well, actually, probably like months before, a lot of CNN stuff and Washington Post saying that, it's going to be a fraudulent election because he's already figured to win, right? And he's arresting all the opponents, and but there's no context to it, right? It's just a quick headline or a 500-word report, and so being there, and then also just shout out to Ben Orton, the research that he does to call out these lies and publish that it's actually against Nicaragua law. You start to realize that, like, I feel bad for the Americans, man, for the people here, because they're being lied to constantly being lied to. And it's unfortunate because they can, we can do so much more if they were being told the truth.
Yeah, no, if you watch TV, like, it's just interesting because when I was in Nicaragua my first time in March of 2021, my mom was telling me that she was watching the news and Nicaragua was in the news, and she was like, "Oh my God, are you safe out there? Like, it's a danger. I hear it's dangerous." In Telemundo and Univision, they're saying that people are being hunted down and it's horrible. I was like, "Mom, it's so fucking safe here. It's safer than Honduras. It's safer than most countries I've been to." And the so-called human rights crackdowns and all these acts of violence that mainstream media was saying were taking place, it wasn't even happening. And it just shows you the discrepancy between what's actually happening, objective reality and truth, versus how mainstream media and bourgeois propaganda is able to rewrite what is actually happening. So it's something that even with these organizations like the CFR and these human rights NGOs, they completely manipulate what's actually happening. And the only way to find out is to actually go to the country and talk to people directly and see for yourself what's really going on. So I'm going to play some more from this webinar.
Venezuela now is pretty unapologetically an authoritarian government. So is Nicaragua, and there has been real slippage in a number of other countries in the region as well. I think it would be appropriate to ask, given the progress made from, say, the early 80s through the year 2000, what accounts for this? And I would say there are a number of key factors. By and large, I would note, the factors are internal. That is to say, they derive from circumstances within the region and are not necessarily a consequence of external subversion. Poverty, inequality, crony capitalism in some cases, criminality, drug trafficking, these things continue to bedevil a range of countries within the region. Endemic corruption is something that individual countries have struggled with, and by and large been unsuccessful in significantly reducing. In effect, governability as a general heading probably explains or is the heading under which we should investigate just why it is that some publics have lost faith in democracy. We've had several really interesting elections lately. Let's set aside just for the moment the reality that particularly since 2013, Venezuela has deteriorated dramatically in virtually every respect, politically, economically, in terms of quality of life indicators, et cetera, as has Nicaragua. And look, for instance, at Peru. Peru has held a free, fair, recently held a free, fair election, one that brought a significant change to the government, in that the new president, a teacher, is a figure of the left. Now, I don't think we collectively, or hemisphere, there's certainly no problem with that. But what accounts for the fact that a place like Peru has seen wild swings between figures of the left and of the right, and has most recently, notwithstanding a decade of mostly sustained significant macroeconomic growth, why have they embraced a figure who so, at least in his campaign, so profoundly challenged the existing system? I would argue it's because macroeconomic growth was not accompanied by microeconomic change, right? That basically the poor remained poor, and the gap between rich and poor was largely undiminished. Arguably, much the same thing has happened recently in Chile, the country which was for decades the yardstick by which the quality of democracy everywhere else in the hemisphere was frequently judged. The new president, or president, I guess he's just taken off here, president-elect in Chile is a young political activist of the left who has, in the past, articulated an enthusiasm for figures like Hugo Chavez or even Fidel Castro. And now, as the elected president, has begun to use a more moderate rhetoric, but again, the country which arguably has had the greatest success in reducing poverty has nevertheless seen a dramatic swing away from a more conventional political figure to someone who is advocating radical change, and the country is on the verge of and in the process of revising its constitution.
I find it interesting that he talks about Boric, the new president of Chile, which at some point I'd like to do an episode on. There's a lot of debates about him. I'm not happy about the fact that Boric has been very critical of Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, and in a way is being praised very highly in mainstream media and is being praised by a lot of right-wing or imperialist think tanks as a moderate left or as a good left, right? Kind of like going back to the picture of myself I showed you earlier, like this kind of identity of like, oh, that's a well-polished leftist, that's a good leftist, not like Ortega or Maduro or Diaz-Canel. I find that really fascinating that Boric is kind of upheld even by the CFR, which is like the premier imperialist think tank. And then I think it's interesting as well that he talks about that all of the factors that take place in Latin America and the Caribbean, like crony capitalism, drug trafficking, corruption, he says they're all internal. They're all happening from within the country. And it's not a quote, not a consequence of external subversion, immediately wiping the hands clean of imperialism, making it seem like the U.S. has no role. And it's part of that free market neoliberal ideology of everything is your choice. You're the way you are because of your choices only. There is no such thing as external choices that led to that. So I don't know if, Abraham, if you have any thoughts on that.
No, yeah, I think one of the things that I wanted to focus on or talk about in the beginning, he talked about poverty, he talked about corruption. We live in Los Angeles where, according to the housing authorities, there's 63,706 people that are homeless in Los Angeles, where there's, I think, over 100,000 or probably things like 200,000 vacant homes. There's not only unhoused people. A few years ago, there was a report that 25% of college state students live in their cars. So where's the webinar and plan, an action plan to help out those people, right? Where's the call to action, right? We have all the resources. They have the power, and if they care as they say they do, why aren't they doing anything about it? And that's neoliberalism right there for you.
Yeah, and it's crazy to see it as well. Even comparing LA, we're both living in LA, seeing the amount of homelessness in LA and poverty versus somewhere like Nicaragua. I was very hard pressed to see any homeless people at all in Nicaragua, very few. And compare it to LA, and it's night and day. And it's just crazy because I think it's interesting as well, because part of the ideology of U.S. imperialism, and some people have also compared it to gaslighting as well, is to make it seem like if there's any problems that you have in your country, it's completely due to your decision making. And even like he's talking about one of the problems that he talked about as well is drug trafficking and endemic corruption. And it's just interesting because the biggest trafficker of drugs is the US government and the US corporations that created the drug trade that's impacting many countries around Latin America and Caribbean, in particular Mexico, Honduras, and Colombia. And it's interesting that recently the former president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was a darling of US imperialism backed by Washington, who many have known for years to be directly involved in the drug trade. In fact, his brother Tony Hernandez was a major drug trafficker, arrested. He's in prison for life for trafficking, in particular cocaine. El Chapo Guzman revealed in court proceedings in New York that he helped finance the campaign of the National Party in Honduras and Juan Orlando Hernandez. And immediately now the U.S. is trying to rebrand their image They recently extradited him. Juan Orlando Hernandez is in the U.S. now, being charged. So even though they're creating these problems, the U.S. puts into place these drug traffickers, creates these crony capitalists, creates corruption. They come in and clean it up, so to speak, and make it seem like, oh, we're the heroes. We're doing all this great and amazing things. So I don't know if you wanted to comment as well in particular about the role of the U.S. in drug trafficking and violence and corruption in Mexico in particular, because that's something that always gets relegated. They're always like, oh, those Mexicans, they just, they can't stop dealing drugs and being corrupt. And the stereotype is always placed on Mexico as opposed to the U.S. that is responsible for that.
Yeah, it's always placed on the workers, right, that are doing what they can to survive. And I would call out even the corporate media and their journalists for not actually going to the root of the problem. I think it was in 2007 or 2008, Wells Fargo admitted to laundering money to the biggest cartels in Latin America. And what happened to Wells Fargo? No one got arrested. They just got a fine, a slap in the hand, paid a fee of a few $1 million. And then Wachovia, again, admitted to laundering money, got caught. And what happened, right? And I think it's safe to say that if it wasn't for the U.S.'s banking system, the cartels wouldn't be able to function. And they always put the blame on, the workers that, are doing what they can to survive under empire.
Yeah, all these banks are implicit in it. And even here in LA, a lot of big institutions are directly involved in the drug trafficking industry with Mexico. And it's crazy to see how the U.S. is able to wipe its hands clean of so much of this violence. And even the processing, like even something like cocaine, like the people who developed these things were all completely foreigners. It's not like the indigenous peoples of like Bolivia or the Andes were the first to develop this. This is all stuff that was created by the empire and synthesized by people who wanted to make money from it. So it's crazy to see that. But I'm going to play some more of this webinar.
The situation in Venezuela, which has generated right around 6 million refugees. It's the largest refugee problem in the world after Syria. Has to some degree highlighted some of the changes with respect to democracy. The first, and I'm going to end very shortly, Irene, and give folks an opportunity to ask questions. The first is the frustration and the inability of the region to enforce its own mandates, its own requirement that democracy be and democratic governance and respect for human rights be a condition for participation in the inter-American system. And further to that, what we've seen is a breakup of the one larger group of countries in the region, which had been attempting to encourage a return to democracy in Venezuela, known as the Lima Group. Right? So what we've seen is that the commitment to democracy as a hemispheric reality has to some degree eroded. At the same time, we are increasingly seeing the region as a theater for big power competition. It was only within the last few days that President Fernandez, for instance, of Argentina, traveled to meet with both the Russian leadership and the Chinese. This is not inherently problematical, but it probably does underscore the degree to which the United States is not the only major power active in the region. Right? We may still have the largest investment stock in the region, but China is now the largest trading partner for Brazil, for Chile, for Peru, the largest creditor for Venezuela. I haven't yet touched on Central America, and that's a particularly difficult set of problems. But what I would note is, while we in the United States are wrestling with a range of issues, from refugees to drug trafficking, we are also simultaneously trying to deepen our trade relationships with the region, relationships which are already very important to the United States. Unfortunately, our political influence in the region, I believe, has become diluted over time by inattention at certain moments, and because of the rise or the introduction of new and different players who are frequently not particularly interested in local political systems, much less democracy per se.
Interesting that he's admitting that the U.S. is losing its presence and influence, definitely hinting at the growing solidarity and trade with Russia and China, and just outright saying that we want to establish more free, quote unquote, free trade agreements, which we know have been horrible for many countries, Latin America and the Caribbean, in different ways. Me and Ophelia did a stream a few weeks back about food and imperialism, and how NAFTA completely has wrecked Mexico's domestic food economy, and how these multinational corporations based in the US have monopolized the Mexican food market, have literally repackaged and sold poison to the Mexican people, giving heart disease, diabetes, all of these horrible diseases that are preventable, and stealing all of the good resources, avocados, beans, all these things that are native to Mexico, and giving it to the rich in the US, while the poor people in Mexico have to eat this processed junk that is sold from the US. I don't know if you wanted to comment about that, the myth of the free trade agreement as freedom and democracy.
No, yeah, I that clip alone, just the colonial attitude of saying like all these nations here don't want to work with us anymore because we've been screwing them over for so many years. Now they got better deals somewhere else, and that's a problem for us now. And it's just like that colonial behavior. It's like it's just disgusting on its face. And to talk about this whole thing about free trade, I just learned that Mexico is one of the top 10 in the world of oil reserves. And what NAFTA and all these neoliberal policies did was it closed down all the refineries. So now when they extract oil, they have to send it to the US. They'll refine it for them, and now Mexico has to purchase it back to get their oil. And AMLO was like, "Yo, why do we do this? Like, how about we just reopen our refineries and let us do refine our own oil and not have to pay the US to get our own oil back?" And that's not a fair trade for the Mexican people. So yeah, that's my part.
No, definitely. And I'm sure in a few years, the US, or even now, the US is salivating at the idea of extracting even more oil from Mexico. And I think another topic that he brings up here that is in this video that was just such a double standard is, talking about the refugee crisis from Venezuela, which first of all was created by sanctions and imperialism. And when we talk about the devaluation of the Bolivar, the Venezuelan currency, that was a big cause for many Venezuelans to be forcefully displaced from Venezuela. Oftentimes, reluctantly, they didn't want to leave the country. So many Venezuelans were forced to move to other Latin American and Caribbean countries. But they don't talk about the refugee crisis from Honduras in particular, and Guatemala, as being a product of capitalism. I'm sure you remember, Abraham, a few years ago, a lot of the attention on the quote-unquote migrant caravans from Honduras, and in particular, and it was never framed as capitalism has failed, neoliberalism has failed. It was always just for some reason they just woke up one day and they decided to cross into Mexico and head north to the US. It was never branded as something that was responsible because of capitalism. But when we're talking about Venezuela, they're always escaping, fleeing socialism, fleeing Chavismo. And it's just interesting how they kind of pick and choose what crises they pick, and even the treatment that different refugees get, or quote unquote refugees, because for example, like I call some of them red carpet refugees. Like a lot of the quote unquote refugees from Venezuela or Cuba or Nicaragua who are right wingers, who tended to be wealthier off, who moved to places like Miami, they get all the red carpet treatment when they get to the US. But look at the migrants fleeing capitalist countries or countries impacted by imperialism, like Honduras and Haiti, which are the two poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere, which are capitalist, which are under the free, quote unquote, free market system, they get sprayed at the border, right? We saw the images of Haitian migrants in Texas that they got whipped. There was like border patrol guys with fucking whips on horseback. The Honduran migrants, tear gas, and now they're talking about these robotic dogs at the border. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, like just the U.S. treatment. When the U.S. talking about human rights, the U.S. treatment of refugees from capitalist, impoverished countries versus wider refugees from socialist countries who are used in this narrative of capitalism.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to put it. How you said the red carpet refugee. You said that. Yeah. They you find one that's from Cuba, and they get all the attention, and so this is the reason why we need to overthrow the Cuban government, because we have people leaving. But there's like no mention of the violence that they're creating in Guatemala and Honduras and other parts of the world. I have a few years ago, I was organizing with this organization where we would do ICE visits. We would go into the detention centers and talk to folks in there, and the group that I was with they weren't all socialists. There were some liberals there, and they were always like, hey, look, there's one person there from China or one person there from Cuba, and they get all the attention. Yet the majority of the people there are escaping violence from Honduras, escaping violence from Guatemala, or even some from other parts of the world that the U.S. is occupying. But there's like no mention of that, and so that empire propaganda seeps into people's subconscious that they don't even realize that, the problems of people having to leave their home, that's because of the U.S. That's because the U.S. is trying to take over, trying to extract their natural resources, and it just shows how empire and capitalism is constantly changing. Woodrow Wilson, I think it was like in 1918, announced and pretty much just sit out in front, said, we're going to invade Haiti and we're going to take their gold. And what happened is exactly what happened. Military showed up, went into Haiti, took their gold and deposited it in New York, right? And the people were just like, whatever. But imagine now Joe Biden went on TV and said, we're going to go and bomb Bolivia because we want to take their lithium. Now they use very words that you can't fight, words that you can't, like, oh, we're going to go there for humanitarian reasons and for freedom and democracy. So then people are just like, oh, well, they're doing something good. So empire is constantly changing, constantly trying to figure out ways to lie to the people. So we have to kind of, unmask it like you do.
Yeah, no, but definitely. And I think like talking about some anecdotes about U.S. imperialist human rights violations, I had a chance to visit Haiti in 2019. I went there twice in 2019 to record and cover some of the protests that were going on against Jovenel Moïse, who was the president of Haiti. He was the one who was assassinated, and not a good guy at all, by the way. He was very right-wing, very pro-U.S. He was part of the Lima group that this asshole in the webinar was talking about earlier, which is the group of predominantly right-wing countries in Latin America and the Caribbean that formed this U.S.-aligned pact to oppose Venezuela. That is a flop, to be honest with you, because the Lima group hasn't even really been functional in a long time. But in Haiti, when I was there, I was able to see directly the impact of U.S. imperialism on the Haitian people, in particular how they fund a lot of right-wing death squad gangs. One of them was a group called G9, which is a death squad group in Haiti that has been involved in murdering and killing a lot of activists who were connected to the La Valace party of former President Aristide, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who is leftist, not necessarily fully like Marxist-Leninist, but he was a Catholic liberation theology activist. He was, I believe, a lawyer as well. He was somebody who was very progressive, and he was removed twice in two coups in 1991, I believe, and in 2004. And it's crazy to see how little attention that gets, the persecution of leftist activists in Haiti. And in 2019, when I went to this one neighborhood called La Saline, which is a base of support for Aristide and La Valace and for the leftist movement in Haiti that had been protesting the government of Jovenel Moise, backed by the U.S. entirely, backed by both Democrats and Republicans. And these right-wing death squads in Haiti murdered dozens of people in this area. And we went to that area, La Saline, and we did a whole report on it that nobody picked up. The major human rights organizations didn't even give a fuck about. And I walked into this one house, man. It was crazy. I think it was probably one of the craziest moments I had in my life of just seeing directly the brutality of U.S. imperialism. I walked into this house. I was with the camera, and first of all, before we even walked in, the house smelled really bad. Like it smelled like a rotting corpse. And as we're walking into the house, one of the guys that we were with told me how a woman in this house was burned alive, and it was a pregnant woman. And he showed us her bones on the floor, and you see like her leg bones and stuff. I don't know what it's called, but like the big and her hip bones and everything. And you just see her bones there on the floor. I'll try to get the video sometime, because I did a whole report on it that we did way back in the day with Real News Network and Pacifica. And it was crazy. It was insane to see that firsthand, like a dead body, the bones, the remains of a pregnant woman who's burned alive by a right-wing US-backed funded trained death squad right there in front of me, and zero public attention. I'm talking zero, like nothing at all. No Human Rights Watch, no Amnesty International, no major media outlets coming and calling for an invasion or anything like that. Imagine if that had happened somewhere else, right? In Nicaragua or Venezuela or Cuba. Mm-hmm. It would have been all over the news. And just seeing that, for me, like even more solidified not only my views as a communist, as an anti-imperialist, and also a solidarity of the Haitian people, because the Haitian people have been struggling for so many years and never get any attention at all in mainstream media, even within the left. And that's a big critique I have with the Latin American left, is that they never show Haiti the love that they deserve and the solidarity. But it just showed me how bullshit the human rights industrial complex, these quote unquote human rights organizations are, because some of the worst atrocities are happening right now under governments that they support and train and arm, and nothing is ever mentioned about that. So I don't know if you have anything similar. I mean, you spent some time in Guatemala as well, and in Honduras, countries that are also have also been devastated by imperialism directly, and very few information on human rights violations in Guatemala and Honduras. I don't know what your experience was like there, and if you spoke to any people who had any stories like that.
No, yeah. In Honduras, we went to trying to remember the name of the town that can't remember the name, but it was an area that got hit really hard with the hurricanes, and we showed up. There was a spontaneous protest where the community came out and they shut down one of the major streets that where all the pretty much all the goods, pretty much all capital goes in and out. So they shut it down, essentially kind of shutting down the economy as a demand to the government, that the government had promised that they were going to rebuild these homes that were taken down from the hurricane. So people were living in, shacks and makeshift stuff. And it was really depressing to see it. And then when I went to Nicaragua, I actually talked to families that were telling me that the government rebuilt their homes that they lost from the hurricane for free. And I was just like, the difference of when you live under a system that it cares about its people and it doesn't care about capital, but it wants to improve the lives of everyone else. And one thing too that I just kind of want to share in the context of sanctions, sanctions are a form of war. I think we all know that. It makes life difficult for a lot of people to survive. And seeing when I went to Iran, seeing what people have to do and to kind of get around, it's amazing. And I think much love for everyone that lives under sanctions, and much solidarity with them, because what they have to do on their own to to be able to get through, whether it's being able to get milk or be able to get money from family that's sending it to them so they can survive and pay their bills. You know, it's amazing, and you know, we have to keep doing our part to fight the empire.
In particular with Iran, one of the biggest problems is the inability to get medical supplies and technology for aircraft equipment, which is very rough. I remember in 2017 or 2018, there were a few plane crashes that took place in Iran. And a lot of the times you're saying is because they didn't have the parts. They weren't able to get the parts because of the sanctions. They were not able to get the proper equipment because they're not even able to buy them. So the safety of Iranian people was compromised and many people died. And a lot of times we don't see that as a crime of empire, as a human rights violation, but it very much is. In particular, especially unemployment or deaths and losses from drug overdoses because of sanctions, because of the depression that's created by it. Also, when we're talking about preventable diseases, when we're talking about so many issues that are directly connected to sanctions, and in Iran as well has been really, really hard hit by that. And sanctions are never, even just the word sanction, it doesn't register in the minds of most people. Just a sanction, like what the fuck is a sanction, you know? But if you're saying economic blockade, economic starving out somebody, that's different. And that's what the US is doing right now to Iran, to Zimbabwe, to DPRK. And I see also Comrade Venezuela, to Nicaragua, to Yemen, to Cuba. And I see Comrade Ruben says Yeonmi Park is an example of CIA propaganda machines. And DPRK in particular is one of those nations that has been really hard hit by sanctions. And that's the way that these human rights institutions from the empire operate, is that they create they create the crises, right? They create, like in Cuba, you had the special period in the 90s, in the DPRK in the 90s as well, you had a really rough time period, and where they basically strangleholded the whole economy, not allowing anything to come in and out. And then the human rights, or that's when the liberals swoop in, right? The conservatives were kind of doing that stranglehold part. They're like, we're going to strangle them. And then that's where the liberals come in, and they're like, look, they can't even feed their own people. They can't even provide medicine. And it's fucking insane, because it's like somebody, one of the analogies I compare it to is like two bullies go up to like a kid, like a kind of scrawny kid in class. One bully is like the stronger one who like just beats the crap out of them to the ground, pummels them to the ground, punches them, strangleholds them. And the other bully is there taking pictures and being like, look, he can't even get up. He's so weak. What is he doing wrong? Well, it's like, all right, this other guy just beat the crap out of him. So how the hell are you going to say all this and decontextualize everything that's going on? As Stephen points out as well, that the same thing happened with Libya as well against Gaddafi, where they basically completely strangleholded the Libyan economy and blamed everything on Gaddafi and the Jamahiriya. So it's just crazy. But I'm gonna just play one last clip from this webinar, and we'll wrap up the discussion about human rights and the hypocrisy that a lot of these imperialist institutions have.
Take the next question from Kennedy Himmel, who does not have access to a mic, a student at University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. There seems to be surmounting evidence to suggest that U.S. imperialism has waged both covert warfare and regime change in South and Central American countries for the last century and our current one. The most notable case of this was Operation Condor, which peaked during Reagan's administration. You suggested the problems plaguing these countries' embrace of primarily right-wing dictatorships as a product of crony capitalism, poverty, and corruption, which are all internal problems. Do you think some of these problems of these countries are a byproduct of U.S. and Western meddling, economic warfare, the imposition of Western neoliberalism?
Well, that's a big question. My own experience in the region dates from the early 80s. And certainly during the Cold War, the United States tended to support virtually any government that we perceived or that insisted that they were resolutely anti-communist. For decades now, the U.S. has made support for democracy a pillar of its policies in the region. And I think we have largely evolved out of the, our earlier, period of either interventionism or, in a sense, sometimes even when we were not entirely, when we were not active, we were complicit in that we applied no standard other than anti-communism to the countries we were willing to work with. That was a real problem. I note, by the way, for any who are interested, that several years ago, about 5 years ago now, if I'm not mistaken, Irina, the Foreign Affairs, which is published by the Council on Foreign Relations, ran a series of articles in one issue called "What Really Happened." For those interested in what really happened in Chile during the Allende government, there is a piece in there by a man named Devine, who was actually in the embassy during the coup and was working, as he now acknowledges, for the CIA. So I refer you to that. My sense in recent decades is that the U.S. has certainly tried to advance its own interests, but has not been in the business of undermining governments. And much of the economic growth which some countries have sustained has derived very directly from the fact that we've negotiated free trade agreements with more countries in Latin America than any other part of the world. I remember very distinctly, about 5 years into the agreement with Chile, that the volume of trade in both directions, and as a consequence, not just employment, but also kind of gross income had very substantially increased at more than 100%. The same has been true with Mexico. We have a history in the region. I think it is largely explained by looking at U.S. policy and understanding that it was almost everything was refracted through the optic of the Cold War. But it's now many decades since that was the case.
So he's really struggling there, man, to answer that shit. And as I think Jason said, this is his job to BS. He's really struggling talking in circles. And he said, it's just that's something that a lot of these apologists for empire do, is like when you ask them a straight up question like, hey, do you think maybe imperialism created a lot of this crisis in Latin America? And he's like, well, that's a big question. It's very complicated. They're always like, it's so complex. There's all these actors. And it's like, no, it's straight and simple. The U.S. empire, because of regime change, because of imperialism, capitalism, because of manipulation, has completely destroyed not only Latin America and the Caribbean, but so much of the global South. And they always want it complicated, convoluted. There's a lot of actors. I remember with Syria, it was the same thing. They were always like, there's no good guys in this fight. And it's like, it's very clearly, Assad and the Ba'athis, the people of Syria against empire and everybody else. So I think that's really interesting. And he just flat out said, quote, the U.S. is not in the business of undermining governments. Your reaction, Abraham, to that?
I couldn't believe he said it with a straight face. It's like, there's a lot of backpedaling. Oh, we don't know. Yeah, we don't do this. We don't, just kind of deflecting. But in reality, we all know what the truth is, right? We all know that it's their strategy is for regime change. And it's when I was talking to a buddy of mine yesterday that what we're witnessing now in the world is a big swift of getting away of working with the U.S., right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a socialist country like Iran, right? They're not a socialist country, but they're under sanctions. So it's like all these blockaded countries working together to completely isolate and leave the U.S. alone. It's a beautiful thing, right? Because you're seeing a lot of people from different cultures, different backgrounds, working together against empire. for a different world. And that's what we preach is another world is possible. And to see him just kind of like, yeah, that's not us. We don't do this. It's it's disgusting and comical at the same time.
Most definitely. And a shout out to Comrade Salifu. Salifu said, this is why when we have the ability, we should never let these people speak freely in public. We should always interrupt them, never give them room to do this. I bet if me, you, and Salifu and others here confronted him in public, he probably shit his pants, that old white dude. He wasn't even able to finish the sentence. Like he knows it's bullshit. And he was picking his words so carefully. He's like, we have a history in the region. It's just, they're using word magic. And shout out to Chris Duran. Homie Chris said maybe the U.S. should remove the blockade then, since the U.S. doesn't undermine countries anymore. And maybe the U.S. should leave Puerto Rico. Yeah, the U.S. has just gotten much better at rebranding. It's all PR, right? The optics. It's all how they brand subversion and empire. Instead of the U.S., like I think we're past the point where we're gonna see a Noriega style like U.S. invasion of Panama, or like Grenada, like against Maurice Bishop or Pinochet. Like we're past that point, right? The U.S. understands that the optics do not look well, especially with social media and the access to information. But now they're just hiring mercenaries. Now they're just coming up with fake news stories. Hybrid warfare. This is why it's so important to really understand hybrid warfare and the role of the so-called human rights organizations in hybrid warfare, because now it's no longer about sending in troops and the Bay of Pigs and all this. Like that's not going to happen anymore. They're sending in their liberals now. They're sending in the NGOs and the NEDs and the vice reporters who are like, we're here in Nicaragua where they're cracking down on those are the new foot soldiers of empire. And I think we have to recognize that, and how the metamorphosis of imperialism, as how you said, Abraham, it's constantly evolving and changing. They have to understand how to rebrand empire, because the optics are going to look bad if they send in U.S. Marines into a certain country. And I think it's something that they very well understand. But Abraham, any final thoughts from you, man? Anything that you want to pitch or shout out that you've been working on, or any final thoughts on the human rights hypocrites and imperialism?
No, just I guess final thoughts would just be, for those who are watching this and trying to get a grasp of understand how imperialism works. It's just, like when they went after Libya, I remember I was, around the time I was getting radicalized, and the New York Times was like humanitarian aid, and it was like them carpet bombing the country. And I was like, how does this is not humanitarian. You don't bomb a country for humanitarian reasons. And to just question everything, question and get to the root of the problem. And a lot of times it's going to lead you to U.S. empire and its hypocrisies and contradictions as well. And one final thought would be to, get involved and get involved in your community and do something about it.
Most definitely. Thank you so much, Comrade Abraham Márquez, revolutionary freelance journalist based in LA. What's your handle, by the way? I forgot to put it in the description. How can people follow and support you?
Yeah, it's just Abe Márquez, ABE Márquez, MARQUEZ, and the number 3.
Márquez 3. Cool. Yeah, he has really great coverage of, especially in particular, his time in Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. And you'll see the difference in his coverage of what the situation is like in those countries versus in Nicaragua. So thanks so much, Comrade Abraham. Hopefully we can chill out here sometime in LA, man. It's been a minute since we've been able to kick it. And hopefully soon we can also do something on Iran, because, you've spent time there and the situation there as well. And it's also a nation that is being under attack by empire. So I'd love to have a bigger discussion on Iran as well. Thank you, everybody, for watching and listening. Peace, everybody. Have a great weekend, and talk to y'all soon. Peace.
Somos americanos, somos hermanos, señores. Tenemos las mismas flores, tenemos las mismas manos.
Si somos americanos, seremos buenos vecinos, compartiremos el trigo, seremos buenos hermanos, bailaremos marinera, respaldos a samba y son. Si somos americanos, seremos una canción. Si somos americanos, seremos una canción. Si somos americanos, no miraremos fronteras, cuidaremos las semillas, miraremos las banderas. Si somos americanos, seremos todos iguales. El blanco, el mestizo, el indio y el negro son como tales. Bailaremos marinera, respalos a samba y son. Si somos americanos, seremos una canción. Si somos americanos, seremos una canción.